Welcome back, everyone. Our next presentation is by Matthew Brewer from Boston University, presenting on Husserl's phenomenological critique of the physical sciences, a response given Hardy's interpretation of the crisis.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get some slides. Oh, sorry. It seems I need permission to do that. Technical difficulties. Sorry. All right, there we go.
Yeah. On your slide.
Sorry, there's no audio on the. Yeah. Okay. Good. Let's do this there. All right. So thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. I apologize for the mouthful of the title there, but today I'll be talking about something maybe slightly different compared to the other presentations, but also related in many ways, but different insofar as it's coming from a phenomenological perspective. Maybe just some context or background where I'm coming from, how I got into philosophy and science. Originally, I was interested in phenomenology, of course, and perception. And then I started considering the perception of measurement instruments, right? And, you know, how do we get from looking at an output display to like believing in some theoretical or unobservable entities exist? There's so much theory that goes into that, so that got me into issues around that and the philosophy of science, models. So now I think I'm firmly a philosopher of science, but I'm still influenced by this phenomenology background that I have. And I wrote this paper a little while ago, but I hope you find it interesting. Let's see if we can. Yes, there we go. So today, of course, I'm talking about Edmund Husserl. And in 1936, he writes a work called The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. And therein he offers a critique of the physical sciences. And he says that scientists substitute what he says, the mathematically substructed world of idealities for the only real world, the one that is actually given through perception, that is ever experienced and experienceable, our everyday life world. Right? So in other words, we're substituting what's actually real, or we're substituting ideal abstractions for what's actually real, right? And scientists are overlooking the real world. That's his critique. So based on these remarks, Husserl is taken to be an instrumentalist or a non-realist regarding scientific theories and the entities that they posit, right? Unobservable entities. Right? Maybe some more reasons to think he's an instrumentalist from other works that he's written. He says things like, we define the real object as the possible object of a straightforward percept. So of course we can't perceive unobservables, right? If you take a strict view of observation that excludes like supplement with instruments, right? He also says that the world of physical things is dependent in its existence upon consciousness, right? So this seems like not like a realist position at all. So Lee Hardy, I think he's professor emeritus now at Calvin University. He publishes a book called Nature's Suit in 2014. And his thesis is actually that, no, Husserl's phenomenology is compatible with realist interpretations of scientific theories, despite what we might think based on what he says in The Crisis. He says it was not Husserl's intent in The Crisis to deny that theoretical entities exist, unobservables, but rather to deny that idealized objects, as they're determined by scientific laws, he's denying that these are real. So forgive me, I'm going to mention again the ideal gas law, which was brought up during our wonderful keynote yesterday. I regret not reading your work before I wrote this, but hey, I learned some stuff here, so that's a good thing, right, that I can put to use later. But for instance, the ideal gas law, right, It defines an ideal gas, as we know, as a gas composed of point particles which do not undergo intermolecular forces. Such gases do not exist in real nature, right? Hardy's saying that Husserl's critique in The Crisis is that scientists mistake ideal entities, ideal gases for material, not theoretical unobservables, right? Right, so that's what I say here, or rather what Hardy says. His critique targets those who would mistake idealized objects as real, while overlooking the actually real bodies that we perceive in the real world, life world, as Husserl calls it, namely non-ideal gases, right? And it's the task of phenomenology, as Husserl understands it, and as Hardy understands it, to show us that what is taken by scientists as most objectively real, or the idealized object, is actually constituted in and through the mental processes of abstraction and idealization, mental processes that take their point of departure in the perceptual givenness of the life world. That's a quote from Hardy. As Husserl puts it, we take for true being what is actually a method. Right. Now, here's some clarification here. Husserl's instrumentalism imputes scientific laws and the ideal entities that they describe. It does not impute scientific theories as a whole, right? And we talked yesterday about the distinction between laws and theories, and I added in the brackets there this morning, causal patterns, right, following the keynote. So maybe like scientific theories describe both laws, like causal patterns, and maybe causal principles, which are like explanations of those patterns. So Hardy says causal principles are informal ideas about the basic constituents of the world and how they relate to one another. If such principles are to be accepted, you must have reason to believe they are true. The laws of the physical sciences, right, that describe, say, like the patterns, the causal patterns, on the other hand, are almost always false, but acceptable if they yield predictions that are close enough. Right? So just for, again, to use the example of the ideal gas law, right, it's not necessarily restricted to a single scientific theory. It might be employed within the context of classical mechanics, right, as we usually think, but also in the context of quantum mechanics. Ideal Fermi and Bose gases, under the right conditions, they behave just like kinetic ideal gases. So, and I'll admit, I'm a bit outside of my expertise when I say that. So if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. Right, so Hardy's saying that Husserl's law instrumentalism cannot on its own decide the extent of the real, right? So there's no reason to say that unobservable entities, theoretical entities, are not real, just based on his law instrumentalism, right? And just maybe as a side note, I mentioned those other reasons why we might think Husserl's an instrumentalist. When he says that we define the real object as the possible object of a straightforward percept, right? It's perhaps the wrong approach to limit perception to human consciousness, right? Maybe we should just consider perception, what could be perceptually given to some ideal consciousness, right? So we shouldn't privilege human sense organs as they've evolved, right, contingently. So, I think bees can perceive ultraviolet light or something like that. So, maybe ultraviolet light is something that is perceivable to ideal consciousness, but not human consciousness. Likewise, the world of physical things is dependent in its existence upon consciousness. This is a subtle point, and maybe you might disagree. This is like an interpretation of Husserl, but he's not saying that the existence of entities depends on our consciousness of them, but only that the justification with which we posit the existence of such entities depends on our consciousness of them. Right. So what appears as a straightforward claim about the existence of things is in fact a claim about the conditions under which we are justified in believing the existence of things. Right. So that's all sort of backgrounds. Right, I've set up Hardy, or rather Husserl's critique, how it's commonly taken, and then Hardy's reinterpretation. No, it's not about theoretical unobservables, it's about ideal objects. So after I considered Hardy's interpretation, I asked myself, if he's right, and that's what Husserl's targeting there, is Husserl right to critique the physical sciences as he does? Is it actually the case that scientists mistake ideal objects for what's real, or prioritize them So these are the questions I'm considering. Do they take ideal objects to be what is truly natural and real? Have they forgotten that laws are abstractions? And my answer is going to be no. Yeah, so my answer is no, and I'll show you why. So for instance, scientists do not mistake the ideal gas posited by the ideal gas law for what is truly real. At least as far as I know. Maybe if I'm wrong, please correct me in the Q&A. But I've considered some of these quotes from some science textbooks that I consulted. Maybe textbooks aren't the best source. Maybe Kuhn thinks, I don't know. But a primary motivation for studying the ideal gas is that all real systems approach ideal gas behavior in the limit of low density and pressure, right? So they approach such behavior. They don't actually exhibit such behavior, right? And in another textbook, an ideal gas is an imaginary substance that obeys the relation, right? Imaginary. So they're under no illusions that these things are real. From the same textbook there. In the range of practical interests, many familiar gases listed there can be treated as ideal gases with negligible error, right? So we treat them as if they were ideal, but we're under no mistake that they are. But why might it be that non-ideal gases are capable of being treated as if they were ideal for such practical interests? So this is where I get a little bit into, I don't know, maybe uncharted territory, at least to me, but I think the same laws govern both ideal and non-ideal gases, and I'll say what I mean by that. It may well be true that an ideal object, such as an ideal gas, can never be realized in nature, but it does not follow from this that if such an ideal gas were realized in nature, it would not have the properties that the ideal gas law demands of it. Because the mathematical laws that govern the ideal objects of the physical sciences are no less valid with respect to the real objects of the life world. Matter does not alter these properties, it merely makes them difficult to reproduce exactly, it obscures them. And I'm drawing on the work of Ernest McMullen here. So it's not that the ideal gas law does not apply to real gases, rather it's that the contingencies of the life world, I think what McMullen calls impediments, present a practical difficulty in realizing the simple relations within the system, right? Within the complexity of the order. The simple relations are there, they're just obscured. Maybe there's a bunch of other relations on top of it that make it harder to see. We might say, to put it in the terms of yesterday's keynote, the causal pattern is obscured by other circumstances. But this is not to say that practical difficulties presented by the life world are not insurmountable, right? The ideal gas law itself was derived from observations of the real, right, by a process of mental acts of abstraction and idealization. So maybe in another instance, Husserl talks a lot about geometry, right? And so given mere spatiotemporal shapes of the bodies that we encounter in the life world, geometers abstract from these and posit ideal geometrical possibilities, right? So like just off the top of my head, an example of like a naturally occurring circle might be like this tree cross section here, and then we abstract from that the perfect circle, right? There are no like perfect circles in nature, right? So subsequently, geometers abstract, or rather reconsider the shapes of bodies in the life world insofar as they differ from ideal possibilities, and in doing so, they apply idealities to the bodies from which they were derived. And I think we might call this de-idealization, and I think McMullen uses the same term. And similarly, right, just as in geometry, in the physical sciences, scientists apply the ideal laws that they posit to the bodies of the life world by de-idealization. And to do so, scientists must allow for and respond to the various impediments of the life world, which obscure the causal pattern that they're interested in. So to use an example, again from yesterday, consider the van der Waals equation. Impediments can be grasped and incorporated into a more refined scientific law that is practically applicable when such impediments present themselves, right? So returning to another textbook, it says the first reason that van der Waals modified the ideal gas law is that molecules, of course, are not point particles. And the second reason is that molecules attract each other, so they experience intermolecular forces. I'm sure we all know this, right? So recall the ideal gas law is at the top there. Van der Waals' modified equation is the second line, where A and B account for the volume of the particles and the intermolecular forces. But when the molar volume V is large, B becomes negligible in comparison with V bar. A over V bar squared becomes negligible with respect to P, and the van der Waals equation reduces to the ideal gas law. Likewise, the van der Waals equation perfectly explains the behavior of ideal gases as the values of A and B in the equation for ideal gases are 0, right? So you're just adding 0 and subtracting 0. You get the same thing as you have at the top there. So given such considerations, I think ideal laws might be said to govern both ideal objects and the real objects of the life world. It's just that the effects of ideal laws on real objects, however, are obscured by extra contingencies. I say the Pauli exclusion principle there, that's related to the Fermi gases that behave as ideal gases. Under certain conditions, right, they behave as ideal gases because the Pauli exclusion principle is no longer relevant under certain conditions, but under other conditions, the principle becomes relevant, and then they no longer behave as ideal gases. We know about the effects of intermolecular forces with respect to typical ideal gases. So I think that de-idealization shows that scientists are always and inescapably confronted by the real life world in their experimental practice. And they must adjust their scientific laws in order to account for the impediments that preclude the real instantiation of ideal laws and objects, right? So scientists are well aware that ideal gases do not really exist, unlike maybe we might say Husserl might think. The ideal gas law is simply a practical tool for understanding the very real and non-ideal gases that confront scientists in the life world wherein their practice occurs. Now I'm going to consider another thinker here, Galileo. This is one of Husserl's explicit targets in the crisis. He says that Galileo was one of the first to sort of commit the sin of replacing the real world with the ideal mathematized world. And Galileo actually wrote a dialogue called Two New Sciences, in which I think we can find evidence counter to Husserl that even he understood that the ideal objects posited by scientific laws do not really exist, right? So one character in the dialogue, Salviati, he states that if the scientist wants to recognize in the concrete the effects which he or she has proved in the abstract, he or she must allow for the impediments of matter. And if he or she is able to do so, Salviati says, I assure you that things are in no less agreement than our arithmetical computations. The errors lie then not in the abstractness or concreteness, not in geometry or physics as such, but in a calculator who does not know how to keep proper accounts. And I think I emphasized that last point. I think that's important, right? We might think that there might be, in principle, a number of scientific laws put in mathematical terms that describe the behavior of every given object in the world at any given time. Say that, you know, a number of laws that maybe describe all of the patterns that we might see. I mean, this is, again, we're talking about idealization, so probably not something we could ever achieve. Of course, the problem is, you know, we're not omniscient calculators. It would be impractical for us to identify and define all the terms, all the parameters of every law with respect to every object at all times. Maybe like God can do this or something, but we can't keep proper accounts. So we cannot account for all causal patterns at one time, but maybe we can choose certain patterns that we're interested in, like the patterns between pressure and volume in certain gases under certain conditions. Right? And even regarding his own investigations of gravity, Galileo considers what would happen to movables very diverse in weight, in a medium quite devoid of resistance, et cetera, right? He says, since we lack such a space, let us instead observe what happens in the thinnest and least resistant media, right? So he knows that we lack a space wherein objects behave ideally, right? We lack like a true vacuum. wherein they move without resistance, at least here on Earth. Right, so he's saying we need to de-idealize, right, when we're confronted with what Husserl would say the life world. But we can get as close as possible. We can get to the thinnest and least resistant media. Right, so he doesn't mistake these ideal free-falling objects in a vacuum as really existent, right? He knows we lack them. Nevertheless, he purports to have discovered the motion that nature employs for descending heavy things, right? McMullen says that Galileo doesn't mean that such motion actually occurs in the real course of affairs, right? It's just what an object or a body would do on its own, apart from the effects of other causes, right? Other things that are obscuring, say, the causal pattern that we're interested in. You might say that Galileo is thinking like subjunctively here, right? Like what would be the case? So he endeavors to investigate ideal motion, right? And I italicize ideal and real here just to emphasize like scientists are always moving back and forth between these two, I think, right? Like he wants to investigate ideal motion, but he has to observe real motion before he can even consider the question. He doesn't have access to the ideal, so he goes to the real to posit ideal laws. Then we verify those maybe by more experiments with more real things in order to approach the ideal. So there's just a constant interplay between these two. But at no point during this process do scientists ever mistake simplified ideal objects for the real world. They're merely posited for practical purposes, for better understanding a specific causal pattern, as we talked about yesterday. So thus, I want to say that Husserl's critique of the physical sciences in the crisis is unwarranted, right? If we are to take him as Hardy says, to be critiquing scientists for taking ideal objects for what's really real. Right? And we can still maybe this is a separate point, we can still accommodate, given Husserl's phenomenology, unobservable theoretical entities. So here's we're excited. And thank you. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. Does anyone have any questions you want to get started with?
Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really interesting.
Thanks.
So I think you did a really good job in like convincingly argued that Husserl missed the mark. But what the question that I have for you is, so like, would it matter for your thesis if it turned out that some scientists did think in the way that Husserl accuses them of thinking? Because ultimately, like when you look at like a chemistry textbook, for example, there's probably like, although there are probably a good resource, they're good resource for finding out what the established consensus is, there might still be some scientists that would disagree with that. So I'm just finding out, yeah, what your take on that is.
That's a great question. And that was a concern of mine too, right? Like maybe the textbooks are something that are produced like after the context of discovery, and like maybe they have different ideas about these things, like when they're actually figuring these things out. Would it matter if scientists took these things to be real, right? I mean, I suppose it would matter insofar as Husserl isn't like totally off the mark. He's onto something there. I think though, I struggle to see, you know, I can't think of any scientists that would though, that would, yeah, I can't see, you know, what maybe practical purpose that would serve. But yeah, I don't think it would matter to the points I make about Galileo. I think it's pretty clear from the historical, at least based on my interpretation, that he's not making the mistake that Husserl is accusing him of. So even if maybe there are some scientists, he's wrong about Galileo and where this whole process started. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Any other questions here? Oh, yes. Yes, thank you again for
Thank
the
you.
talk. Yeah, I'm just wanting to push a little bit on like what is real here versus
Mhm.
ideal. Like, if the case is that, like, for example, the ideal gas law is within nature, but just obscured by these complicated variabilities in matter that occur, would that perspective not take those as still being real and not ideal? I don't know if I'm misunderstanding your point.
No, yeah, that's a good question. Right, like what are the implications of the fact that these ideal relationships or patterns are nearly always obscured? Can we even still, is it right to even call them real in that sense? They're present, but they're never there in isolation. Yeah, and I think we're getting into tricky things too about, right, like we say that like an entity maybe is real if it exists, but like to what extent is like a pattern real, right? Like we can identify it, but it's not always clear, right? We have to like idealize and idealize in order to get there. This is all to say that this is definitely an issue that I need to think more about. Maybe I shouldn't commit so much to saying that these are real, maybe just that scientists aren't so confident that they are real. Like maybe I should be slightly more modest in my claims, but
No, that's okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
No, well, thank you. That was a good question.
All right. Any other questions here? I should also check.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. That was
Thank you.
great. I have a question I want to pick up on some of the same points. And so hopefully the questions aren't too duplicative of what you just answered. But yeah, I wondered if, so I don't know enough about Husserl to know whether he would be, but I wonder if he would be happy with the picture that you've given us. I am. So I think causal patterns are real.
Yeah.
And I think that that makes sense as a way of making sense of a relationship between the great epistemic value of science and how it relates to everything that's in front of us. But I wonder if, judging just based on the Husserl quote that you gave us to begin with, if you would not want to say, well, sure, your physicists don't get confused and think that the gases they're looking at are actually ideal. But the mistake that they're making is in thinking that actually PV ever equals nRT, right? In thinking that the ideal gas law ever, right, that as you said, there's no perfect circle. It's never the case that perfectly PV equals nRT. And so the idea of the very idea that sort of these patterns are what's real and that complexity is somehow obscuring these patterns is what has gone wrong in the scientific way of thinking.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good question. You know, I maybe I was so set on like saying no to Husserl that maybe I should consider, well, maybe he would be amenable to this sort of position. Yeah, I mean, if we go to the quote.
Can I ask a quick question? Sounds
Sure.
like I might have gotten it backwards. I thought you were trying to give an account of why Husserl didn't need to worry.
Well, that's what I'm
Okay,
saying.
okay.
Yeah, so he's wrong to worry.
Okay.
Essentially is what I'm saying. So no, Husserl, don't worry. Chill, Husserl. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, right, it seems like if it seems we can maybe believe that causal patterns are real without substituting them for the ideal world. I think that's a position that you might be sympathetic with. I think I am too. So yeah, I think Husserl would definitely be sympathetic to that. I think I need to think more about and probably read your book about what a position like that might look like, which is why I really loved your presentation. So it's on my reading list. So thank you.
Thanks.
All right, any further questions? Yes.
So this is just a question about the historical context,
Sure.
because you framed Husserl as responding to Galileo, but I'm wondering if he's responding to Kant or any of the neo-Kantians in the late 19th century, because it might be more apt to think of them as likely substituting these sort of mathematical structures and treating them in the way that he's objecting to. I don't know Husserl at all, but that seems like perhaps a more likely target. And if so, then how does that affect your reading? Or maybe Kant is not part of the picture at all. So.
Well, thank you. I must admit, I am also, I don't claim to be the expert on Husserl, so it's quite possible that he is targeting some Kantians here. To be quite honest, I'm not a Kantian either, so I'm not really sure, how that might work. But I don't think that would necessarily be a problem with my account. I don't think it is necessarily a problem who it is that is mistaking this mathematical world for the real world. So long as he's pointing out the mistake in doing this. So yes, this is also to say that I will definitely look more into this and consider how maybe he's in a conversation with Kantians here and Galileo is just sort of
I think
a straw person or something.
So Casira is around the same time.
Okay. Cool, I'll take note of that. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, perfect. So would you like to ask your question?
Did you, have you, it is me you were talking to?
Yes.
Okay,
Go on.
I just wanted to do a little follow-up on the Kant, on Chris's suggestion. The Kant case, I'm trying to, Kant, I think it was very useful for you to focus on Galileo.
Thank you.
For Kant, I think that he's he's a kind of instrumentalist,
Right.
but you're
I
fitting,
quotes brought that out, but yeah, go on, sorry.
but it's not like the quite different from, in my opinion, from the positivist type instrumentalists. And in that he thinks that the whole theoretical picture is being grounded. The idealizations come up in the theoretical picture so that the very much like the Galileo sort of stuff, but that that picture isn't itself getting at the real world in some more deep way. I'm not being very, his views are fairly complicated about this. Uh, and I'm actually convincing myself that on the way he does it would go with getting the his deeper sort of thing about the thing in itself was meant to handle something else. So okay, I'm going to back off now. But I really liked I really liked the your discussion of the ideal gas law and no in the particular in the applications you want to know it's important that the differences that would come if you did the details of a van der Waals for lots of applications wouldn't make a big difference.
Right.
And that I think is a very important part and is and where Galileo just threw up his hands on being able to handle these other problems and interactions. Of course, later science is, as the van der Waals is an example, are trying to get more and more refined, somewhat less idealized models that can handle a wider range of phenomena. Sorry, that wasn't very clear.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked, the ideal gas law stuff and the Galileo stuff. I think you've encouraged me to go back and look closer at some of Galileo's writings. And I'll say I'm sympathetic to some of the ideas that we talked about yesterday regarding this idea of like limit cases of these causal patterns. So like the van der Waals being like developed out of like a limit case of ideal gas law. Like I think that is on the right track. It's something that I want to think about further. So thank you.
Great. Oh, yes. Next question.
Thank you for the talk. It was super interesting.
Thank you.
I'm going to try, which is weird for them to say this, but I'm going to try to defend Husserl a little bit.
Sure.
I think it is important there in the first quote there, right? The mathematically structured world of idealities for the only real world. And the only is, I think, Husserl's target here, at least in one interpretation of phenomenology, right? Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, so all these phenomenologists, think that we have direct awareness of the real world through our experience, through perception itself, right?
Right.
So they trying to react to this idea that our perception is somehow deceiving us, and only through the instruments of science we get to the real world. But in our experience, we are not getting there, right? And that's what the only there, right? So Merleau-Ponty, Husserl too think that we access through our experience to the real world too. And this doesn't mean that we cannot have instruments to see the real world in a different way, right? Like the instruments and the idealizations of science give us access to maybe causal patterns that we don't have access to if we don't have those tools. But the target here is to try to say that the only way to access to the real world is the scientific idealization, right? So I would say that he would be happy saying we have direct access to the real world through our experience, and then we can use instruments, both scientific instruments and other ones like tools, to access to our world in a different way that is also real, right? But we just use those instruments there. And just pointing out that I think that he was reacting to Kant in some sense, right? For Kant, our access to the real world is already through some idealizations that are not scientific, but causation, substance, all these pure concepts are there. So we are always in the interface, but not in the noumena, right? Well, Husserl thinks that, and Heidegger too, and Merleau-Ponty too, that through experience we get to the noumena, so to speak, even though we can use other tools, but these tools are not the only means through we get there. So I would say that he will be happy with being a realist and an instrumentalist at the same time in some ways, right? Like I think Angela is, or so just.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to that view. Like when I was saying in the beginning that I got into this through perception and like perception of instruments, that's exactly what I was talking about. Like supplementing, bare naked perception with instruments. Like I want to endorse, I guess, like a permissive view of observation rather than a strict one, right? So we can observe things with the help of instruments. But I really like that you're pressing on this word only here, right? And I think maybe I overlooked that, right? So maybe Husserl's saying it's not the only world, right? We can have both in a sense, one supplementing the other. So yeah, I'm personally sympathetic to that view. I think I need to think more about how Husserl would take it. I think you're probably right, though, that I think he would also agree with something like that. So yeah, I think I'm on board. It's not.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You have any further questions? Oh, yes. Oh my gosh, sorry.
Thanks for a great talk. I think it's more like a comment in order to motivate some discussion here. Like I happened to read Carnap's Aufbau, the logical structure of the word, and last term with the reading group. And also very interesting that in the book, Carnap himself used kind of phenomenology to he wants to reconstruct the physical theories or our world picture from both the logic and also the sense data, or subjective sense data. For example, he wants to reconstruct spatial or temporal relation on our subjective sense data of the image world, so that he can construct step by step our physical theories or psychological theories. And so I think, given you are more familiar with Husserl and those phenomenologists, I think it'd be interesting. It would be interesting to discuss what kind of relation between this early logical empiricism and those, especially Carnap and Husserl. So.
Well, thank you. This is adding to my list of things I need to think more about, which is great. No, but that's why I'm here, right?
Giant book.
Yeah. Maybe someday. But no, I'm sort of sympathetic to this idea that pretty much most of everything that we know about the world at least comes down to perception in some way. Maybe not just perception, but perception with, as we were saying before, with the supplement of instruments. I think I don't know if that's a trivial point, it's just something that's so obvious. But I think most of what we know can come down to that, right? Even in the most complex of practices, we're looking at displays of data output. So yeah, maybe it's trivial, but I want to think more about it and think about maybe maybe Husserl was onto something here by when he says something where is it? We define the real object as the possible object of a straightforward percept. The world of physical things is dependent in its existence upon consciousness. Right, right? But as I said, maybe it's our justification with which we posit these things. So maybe we derive justification for everything that we know about the world, right? I say about the world to exclude like a priori knowledge, but maybe justification for everything about the world, like post hoc, comes from perception, at least to some extent. Yeah, I need to think more about Carnap. So thank you.
Great, okay. Any other questions from the audience here? Online too. Yeah, sure. All right. Well, thank you so much again for your presentation.